this next paper will be presented to us by Ziad Hassan, entitled The Impact of Multi-Scale Analysis on the Development of Virtual Material Allowables. Now, Ziad is a project manager at General Atomics, formerly worked at Boeing for 7 years in supporting various programs, and he holds a PhD in aerospace engineering from Arizona State. So welcome.
Thank you. All right, so thank you so much for attending. So today I'm going to be talking about some analytical approach to compute virtual allowables. Although my approach is slightly different than I think there was a couple sessions regarding this topic overall, but you heard some information about me. Currently I'm in General Atomics, as a PM/PE, working on also different platforms there. So the outline of the presentation, initially I'll talk about aerospace structures in general, multi-scale analysis, the problem statements, some of the analysis type, and preliminary results from some of the work. But I did want to highlight that specifically I'm talking about aerospace structures, and the reason for that is it's pretty different when you compare it to automotive, from the certification aspect and the criticality of some of the details within the structure. So as a lot of you guys know, we don't allow specific porosity percentage, typically 2% porosity or less, and that's really hard to achieve sometimes within whether you're talking thermoplastic. So it's a pretty critical detail, right? And we look very hard on making sure we understand the material before using it in any product. Typically speaking, you have an airplane development program that starts at a certain time frame, and if you can see here, typically it takes from 5 to 7 years from the launch up until you have first flight. While a material, when you find out a material in the development phase of it takes typically from 6 to 9 years. So clearly they don't match up, and sometimes you have a material system that cannot actually be used on some airframes. So the question is, how can we reduce that to 2 to 3 years? And a big piece of that is going to be really generating this allowable piece of it, because this takes sometimes 2 to 3 years, right, to develop, and multi-million-dollar programs typically. And one big thing is going to be using analysis, right? So this is something that's published online, you can go find it, and a lot of people have been talking about that. So a baseline test program, could contain up to 31,000 coupons. Could cost $6 million approximately, but if you combine it with some analysis and simulation, you can reduce it quite substantially. In this phase, the person that discussed this really didn't necessarily talk about the subscale and the full scale on the building block, which I'll talk about in a second, rather only the element level, right? So only that small scale. Well, I am taking it a step further. I'm saying, well, we can also go look at the larger scale, because just looking at the material scale is really not enough. Sometimes we want to understand what's happening on the subscale level, the subcomponent, and the full scale. More specifically, in my case, I'm saying, we can do also virtual allowables here, on the subscale level, by understanding the failure modes that you're seeing on a specific structure, right? And this is just taken from Mill Handbook, and I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with the building block. So you come to the multi-scale framework. This is probably not new, right? A lot of people have been talking about this. How can you take something from the atomistic scale to the full scale? And that is a huge challenge. A lot of people have been working on it, and one thing I'm proposing in this case, which is, I am truly going to take this as a multi-scale framework from this level up until this level, the elements, and that's quite a bit of a jump, because typically we're stuck really right here. We're stuck on the coupon level, but I'm taking it one level up by combining it with the element level and or subcomponent, right? So, what do I mean? Well, virtual allowables is not new. In the 1990s, there's a lot of virtual testing. 2001, the famous AI, the AIM program from DARPA, that generated a lot of work on this field. 2015, there was quite a bit of talk about that also during CAMX, ironically. And then, I'm coming here and I'm saying what I just stated, which is how can we go one level up on using it for the subcomponent. To do that, what you need to do is understand your structural behavior, okay? So as a lot of you guys know already, composites are pretty weak out of plane. So the out of plane behavior of composites is pretty weak, and it's generated through a lot of these reasons, right? If you have a straight edge, you have stress concentrations at that point, the change in geometry, the change in stiffness, the asymmetry, and so on. So that's a pretty big problem within composites, and a lot of people have been solving it through different manners. And what you're seeing here is the specific problem I'm talking about. Okay, so this is actually a wing demo that we recently built for a specific program, and it's a pretty large wing demo. It's roughly 35 feet long, and it's a stiffened wing section. It has half stiffeners, and one known issue is this noodle, or otherwise known as a toe filler. So this toe filler cracks in this location, and we know that this is the critical, for lack of a better word, margin. So we're really sizing this structure to this type of failure moment. So I'm saying, okay, well, why are we looking at a bunch of material testing? Although I understand the value of them, of course, but I'm saying, well, let's initially, to size this and get the data necessary and have a better design, start from here, understand our structural behavior through preliminary testing, and then generate allowables for this specifically, also virtually, okay? So, a simplified, I think there's like, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 patents right here on solving that problem via design. Whether it's putting a ply in between that region, or whether it's through some structural method, some behavior. I don't think this is necessarily the best answer. The best answer is really understanding it early on and eliminating the need for redesigns. Because this is all after the fact. This is after the fact they found this problem. They went and redesigned them. This is where the approach comes in. So it's again a multi-scale framework. What that means is that I am initially starting with resin fiber. I want to understand the behavior of both through analysis. I get the properties and I embed them into a micromechanics framework, which is the second level, into getting the lamina properties. And then finally, this feeds into the macro scale, so through finite element analysis. The first scale, the atomistic scale, in my case, I use lamps. A lot of you guys are probably familiar with that. It's an open source software code that allows you to do some micromechanics analysis on that. And specifically, I was interested in this scale of getting the thermal expansion of the resin at different temperatures. So another big reason those cracks that you saw is sometimes during the cool down cycle of autoclave. We heat up to 350 and then cool down to 70. And for the most part, we assume that the thermal expansion is constant from 350 to 70, but that's really not the case, as you can see here. It has a nonlinear effect. And another advantage of using analysis, you can actually get this nonlinearity in the model through analysis, which is extremely difficult in testing, right? We get the thermal expansion through the scale. We bring it to the mesoscale, and in this case, I'm using a micromechanics framework. So Mori, Tanaka, you name it, right? There's quite a bit of formulations out there to use. And then from here, you get this table, which is the lamina material level. So what you're seeing here, you have the modulus, right? And the longitudinal, transverse, shear modulus, Poisson's ratio. And also, as we saw in the previous slide, you're getting the thermal expansion at different temperatures. You also get the thermal expansion at different temperatures for the lamina. At 70, at 140, 200, 250, 300, 350. And I'll explain also a reason why this is important here in a second. When I get that, and then it feeds into the finite element approach, to get an allowable, you need to define the failure. So in my case, I am stating that the failure is the first drop in a load displacement curve. So if I was able somehow to run a simulation that generates displacement versus load, right, like this, run it to some failure scheme, that would be my allowable, okay? The failure mode, or the failure method that I'm going to be using is the virtual crack closure technique. It's a fracture mechanics based failure technique. So essentially what's happening is I identified my material property, I embedded it into a finite element code, and I went in and ran a bunch of simulations. Each simulation is going to run up until a failure, and the failure defined is the first drop in the load displacement curve, or the first node release. The first node release correlates to a fracture mechanics, which is the strain energy release rate, right, of that specific laminate. With all that information, then you can also take that and then use a simplified element test. So as I explained earlier, this what you're seeing here is a typical element test. So this right here is the finite element model that I created. It's a blade stringer on a skin, on a composite skin as well. And we are doing a pull-off test. So the pull-off test is a typical mechanical loading that a wing structure would typically see. And it's like pulling on it this direction. For this method to work, you need to have a flaw embedded. And we looked at two type of flaws. This one around the corner, and then underneath this toe filler. And the reason for that is because those are the common locations at which a failure occurs. So we can run the simulation at both, and you pull on this model, and it keeps on running up until the first node releases. When the first node releases, you say, oh, this is failure to me. I extract the load, and that would be my allowable load. Okay. And just to complete this, what you're seeing here is the steps. So I run a cool down model. So the steps of the model is I run a cool down from 350 to 70. And the reason for that is because I want to understand the impact of the cool down, because that has a substantial impact on the cracking. And then I also include fastener preload, which also doesn't have a substantial effect, but just for accuracy purposes. And then finally, the actual mechanical load, which in this case is a pull-off. I think you can ask questions, yeah.
Just a quick clarification. So you modeling the contact between the noodle and your carbon?
There is nodes released. So I am essentially simulating a flaw here. And to simulate a flaw is going to be, they're all in contact, yes, for the exception of this area. Does that make sense? So it's going to be here in the middle. So you have contact all across for the exception of here. It's simulating having an embedded flaw. It's like an FEP layer. So you release the nodes. It's like an FEP. That's a typical test, right? So we do a lot of allowables like that. But I'm just simulating it. You have an FEP layer, and then the node releases at that location. You'll see some results in a second. So let me try to walk you through this chart. So what you're seeing here, because this is the allowable essentially, what you're seeing here is the x-axis is the number of web plies, because different web plies on this location or the flange. In this case, it's the whole thing. I'm calling it web plies. Depending on the web plies, the allowable load is changing. Each dot is representing a one simulation. So for this case, the model had 10 plies, and the first node released that, what is it, like almost 90 psi, or pound per force, sorry. And it's black, meaning it's for the first flaw. Okay? So clearly, flaw number 1 is more critical than flaw number 2. Going back here, flaw number 1 was the one on the corner right here. So you run the simulation several times, and then you generate a behavior for both flaws, depending on what you're expecting in your actual airframe. And you get this chart. This chart is representing your allowable. An additional thing that I've been saying, there's temperature dependent CT or baseline models using constant CT. So again, if you assume that your thermal expansion is constant during the cool down model, the displacement actually makes a difference. So take a look. If I did have a temperature dependent CT, so the alpha, the thermal expansion is changing, you get different behaviors, and that is pretty critical because your prediction of when when a node is going to release is going to make a difference. And the only way really to get those type of properties is going to be using thermal simulation. Getting it through testing is really difficult at that level. Then, in this case, I'm just also showing the failure. So, to answer your question, what you're seeing here, maybe the next chart is a little bit better, but this location is my FTP. It's like a 1/4 inch by 1/2 inch around flaw, and this is where nodes are released in this area. And this red dot, what you're seeing here, or this red region right here, is a failure index, which is when my failure index reaches 1, that means failure occurred, essentially. So as you can see here, the purpose of this slide, or this graph here, is showing you the baseline CT versus temperature dependence. I ran both, right? And what you're noticing is that for the temperature dependence, it's failing, so it reaches 1, meaning failure. It reaches 1 much quicker, or in a smaller displacement compared to the baseline CT. You might say, why does that matter? Well, because your computation, your margins of safety you computed, or analysis might be conservative, or the opposite, might be unconservative, right? And that's why we see failures at the higher scale. So sometimes using more accurate simulation could be to your advantage as well. So not only it reduces cost during the preliminary design phase, but also allows you to predict or simulate your behavior more accurately. Another thing I did just to complete the analysis is propagation. So I allowed the crack to propagate, right? And what you're seeing here is that the baseline model, the crack propagates much more aggressively compared to the temperature dependent CTE. And there's many reasons for that due to the displacement behavior of the model itself. So that's just showing you another reason for ensuring if you simulate some of the details a little more accurately, you can get a much accurate, more representative behavior compared to the experiment that you do. So this brings me to the end and the conclusion, and we discussed how you can get allowables on the different scales through analysis. Again, it's much different than previous information in the literature that I am proposing going up the scale, up the ladder on the building block. I'm also saying you need to initially identify the allowable that's driving the sizing. There's no point of doing a bunch of testing before in the preliminary design phase and even prior to CDR, prior to critical design review. I would highly recommend this approach, in which is something we were trying to do as well in our committee. But identify the allowable that's driving the sizing, and then focus on that initially. Multi-scale work uses MD simulations, micromechanics, and the finite element combination to take it from the atomistic scale up to the element or the subcomponent. And you can add additional fidelity, right, to reduce conservatism or lack thereof in the analysis. And we noticed that using a constant CTE versus a temperature dependent did make a difference in the loads and the allowables that you saw. So, of course, if anybody has more questions, I'll be happy to clarify.
Questions?
So are you doing
Yeah.
testing to verify your analysis?
Yeah, we actually have done testing. I don't show it here. We have done quite a bit of testing, and specifically on correlating the crack propagation as well as the first node release. And I would say we're within 30%. 30% of what essentially is the length of the crack that you're seeing, predicting the length of the crack right here. How wide it grows, through NDI, as well as the load at which crack initiates. And it's within 30% comparison. There's many reasons for that. We didn't do a lot of specimens during the test, so we need to first of all do additional testing. But definitely, we need to do probably a little bit more on the material level. So not on this level, probably early on the MD7, which is a little bit more difficult. Right?
Yeah, I really like this work. I've been this is the kind of thing I've been encouraging my progressive damage guys at Lockheed to focus on higher up the building block scale, where the testing's more expensive. You know, this is several $1,000s per coupon now when you're doing this kind of stuff, and it takes longer, and so a simulation will maybe save you more. And that's what Boeing, I'm curious to see what Bill thinks, that, you know, what Boeing's initial success with replacing testing with virtual testing was like that two-bay crack stuff that somebody did with the firewall tools, as I recall, and that, you know, it's been a number of years ago now.
Right.
I know y'all are pretty far along with using
Right,
these.
I guess what we consider to be the successful virtual testing, if you will, is BCCT for the delamination.
Yeah.
Okay, so we use
Yeah,
that,
I use that a
we
lot.
use that a lot.
Right.
And, you know, with the pull-off things like you see here,
Yeah, this
right?
is good.
You know, flaws we call A and A plus, and A plus plus, and all those names we give the flaws depending on the, you know, location they exist. So I'm not aware that we've investigated kind of nonlinear effective CTE, so I'm kind of curious about, you know,
In my
about that.
master's thesis, go back. Mike hired maybe
Yeah,
do
do some of the
temperature
nonlinear.
dependent
Yeah, I mean,
CTE.
Yeah, we have to get
And-
it for our material system, right?
Right, yeah.
I mean, the thing is, you know, how do you get it, right? You get it through a TMA test or whatever test you want to do to get some of the alpha expansion. It's just difficult in testing. And,
Yeah, NASA back in the day was just doing very high fidelity Moray CTE measurements on unidirectional coupons, right? So they could measure CTE, thermal strain versus temperature, really is what you measure, right? So-
Right. As a matter of fact, I mean, this here, I'm referring to you, by the way.
Yeah, I know.
Lockheed is the guy. So, but I mean, yeah, because you know, I'm obviously looking at the literature, right? Because, well, one thing, I'm looking at the literature and I'm trying to make sure, I'm like, man, you know, we've been talking about this, and I might look young, I'm not. But I'm looking at things and I'm like, man, even in my time, and it's been, you know, 8 years, it's like, come on, you know, we need to do something here. So I'm trying to push this, but as you guys all know, it's very hard to change the aerospace field. Everybody's stuck on something. It's just difficult.
Things move very slowly.
Yeah.
No doubt about that. I would encourage you and your employer to pester the Air Force Research Lab. They're very, you know, open to progressive damage tools and methods, and they're trying to push the state of the art as much as they can. NASA also.
Right,
on
right.
ACC,
Which is,
so-
yeah,
So
that's
it's
encouraging.
glad they're doing that, but it does go slow. But the one thing you miss when you do the virtual testing, though, is sometimes those element level tests are to validate your failure criteria in your stress tests, right? And so you're not really, maybe the argument would be the virtual methods are validated at a lower scale, right? So maybe the other thing is you don't have a statistical knockdown if you're relying on simulating the pull-off test to get a design value. That'll give you like a median mean value, but
Yeah.
you have to know something about variability and statistical, you know, distributions.
I agree. I mean, to add to that, you know, you said that you don't know, you need some testing. So you're right. I mean, we've done testing to identify this issue.
But you know, simulating it first allows you to really zero in on.
Correct.
You can only test one configuration instead of five.
Exactly, yeah. So the suggestion is preliminary design and pre-CDR.
Yeah,
Pre-CDR.
absolutely.
So post-CDR, sure, do more testing. Right, look how, these are just a snippet, there's like maybe 10 more patents on this topic.
So I guess a couple comments. One, I'm a little surprised by your apparent failure criteria in the first low drop. Okay, so that seems way conservative. It's more conservative than we do. Usually we pick something to pull off that's for like a 10% low drop or something, you know, it doesn't, certainly it's not going to grow or change the stiffness of the part, you know, the limit or something like that.
Right.
So, and then the other comment I was curious about kind of your modeling to get the CTE. I mean, there's lots of labs out there that can, you know, that do high accuracy CTE measurements, right? That should be able to generate
Yeah, I'm not aware of that, but that's good to know.
Yeah, there's, I think PMIC, a company called PMIC in Oregon,
Okay.
I think they can do it.
Because that would be, I mean, the thing was convincing the structural guys that don't use a constant alpha. You know, because that's what they have in their allowables data set.
I think PMIC stands for Precision Measurement Instrument Company.
Okay.
So, I think it was founded by a guy out of one of the national labs or something, or the aerospace company, I think it was a guy from the aerospace company.
Yeah.
That founded it.
Right, thank you, yes.
All right, great discussion, thank you all.